Okay, so well, thank you. Another thank you, actually, John, for the invitation to be here, which came after a short conversation that we had within another conversation. We have a lot of conversations. Um, and through those conversations, I found out about this fantastic space, which is the Therapy and Social Change Network, and also about Mick Cooper's book, The Psychology at the Heart of Social Change. Um, Now, that conversation I had with John and the blog I wrote and the preparation for this talk were all done many months ago, and certainly prior to October the 7th of this year. I'd even done the preparation for this talk a couple of months ago, and it's a lot of advanced planning. Um, and the talk's called, as John said, The Power of Teeny Tiny, How Getting Over Our Sense of Inadequacy and Doing Something Can Power Change. Now, there are a lot of people here, which is extremely gratifying, and you may have signed up to this talk because you thought it was a response to the events in Israel and Palestine. It isn't specifically. And so I'm still going to give the talk I planned because what I want to share with you relates to those events in some ways, and in other ways, it doesn't. And by that, I mean that some of this talk is about thinking about how we can hold back the desire to rush in to do something, hold back and wait to use the fire that gets stirred up in us so that we make the offering that can be of use rather than the offering we may initially feel pulled to give. And in this talk, I'm going to share a model of the social response cycle. It's not particularly clever, it's not even particularly original, but I have found it useful in avoiding the pitfalls of inaction. But at the same time, it has helped me avoid the pitfall of reacting too fast. So the social response cycle model encourages you to review what is happening and reflect without getting stuck at the conceptual and contemplative phase. So I'm Beverley Costa, and just a little bit about me. I'm a psychotherapist, a clinical supervisor, a trainer, and a senior practitioner fellow at Birkbeck, the University of London, and a senior visiting fellow at the University of Reading. Now, I've been interested in this combination of therapy and social change for 2 decades. The power of psychological therapy to be transformative at the level of society, as well as at the individual level, has driven me over the years. Now, a little bit more before we go to some slides. I wrote in the blog that accompanies this talk that when one of my sons was very young, about 6 years old, he was fascinated by power, any kind of power. And what else, to be honest, what else do you dream about when you're young and everybody else seems to have power and they don't even know how to use it properly? So he spent a long time wondering about how to get power for himself, and eventually he came up with a formula. And the formula was so simple and so powerful that I've tried to live by it ever since. And this is what he came up with. By thinking and doing, that is how you get power. Thinking and doing. So this formula serves as an antidote for me when I experience the inertia that can overpower me when I feel inadequate in the face of an enormous social justice issue. My immediate pull in that situation is towards thinking, let's write an article about this, or towards doing, let's just do something, anything, give money, assuage my guilt. I'll say more about guilt later. But I've learned, just as my son did, that real power comes from a combination of thinking and doing, reflection and action. Later on in this talk, I've already said that I'm going to introduce a cycle called the social response cycle. and an example of the thinking and doing response in the form of one project called Colleagues Across Borders, which offers online support for psychosocial workers who are themselves mainly refugees and from a refugee background, and who work in refugee support NGOs in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, in camps and urban settings. And that's been going since 2013. So the project, Colleagues Across Borders, could be accused of being a sticking plaster when an entire health service is needed. In fact, as a response, it is inadequate. And yet I'm presenting it here, not as a failure, but as something effective. Sorry, something's just come up on my screen. And do I need to do anything about it?
I don't think so. Have you got the captions notification maybe?
Yes, a participant has enabled translation.
I think you
Am
can
I
just,
supposed to do something about that?
I think there's just a button to cancel or save Beverly
Okay,
on the,
all
yeah,
right,
great.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Okay, so and that's one of the reasons I'm not looking at the chat, because I'm so distracted. Okay, so I'll just go back to what I was saying, that I'm presenting this project and it is inadequate, and yet I'm presenting it here not as a failure, but as something effective. And in the process, I'm suggesting that we recalibrate the terms good enough and inadequate. Because unfortunately, even good enough often feels unreachable. But that poor cousin, inadequate, is more often achievable. And inadequacy is more than nothing. Inadequacy in the face of vast humanitarian need is a reality. An ethically framed and accountable offering, even if it isn't meeting all the needs, is nothing to be ashamed of. Don't think that inadequacy is lacking in value. Inadequacy is more than nothing. You may not be solving a global crisis, but cumulative, inadequate, but carefully and reflective interventions can make a difference that no one imagines possible for each individual act. So I'm going to now go to a little bit more background before we get to Colleagues Across Borders. So a little bit about my history to position what I'm saying. So I'm going to go to the slides now. And we practiced earlier, so I'm hoping they're going to work. Looks like they're doing okay. So this is just the title slide. And I'm going to go now to this little bit of background and history that I said I would go to. Okay, so in 2000, I set up an organisation called Mother Tongue Multi-Ethnic Counselling Service to address a gap I'd identified in Reading in terms of an accessible and culturally and linguistically relevant counselling service for people from ethnically diverse communities. To set up the organisation, I applied without realising it at the time what would come to be the social response cycle. So that was in 2000, and it seems that the social response cycle is more relevant and that the environmental, political and social issues are even more urgent today. At the heart of the social response cycle is the belief that very small initiatives, and that is where the teeny tiny comes in, can be of disproportionately large value to individuals and communities. That waiting for the evidence from formal, well-funded research often means inaction because there are no funds left over to implement the findings. And that a more reciprocal process of gathering evidence means that the data doesn't have to justify practice, practice provides the data. And the social response cycle is a model which can help people who are concerned about social justice to build their confidence to take socially responsive action when they identify a need. And although the action that the social response cycle is about is therapeutically framed, the principles and ethics apply broadly to all initiatives which involve people. And this became the model we use for all our future projects. So you'll be able to look at some of these slides, which have quite a bit of detail on. You'll be able to look at them at your leisure in the recording. But it's just to show you here, the social response cycle is based on other people's learning cycles. Okay, it's not a new invention. But the major difference with the social response cycle is that it is specifically applied to therapeutically framed social action. And as I said earlier, it helps to move into action rather than getting entangled in reasons for not acting. So when there was a gap in services, for example, that could be filled by a therapeutically framed response, this is the model that I found useful. It's a model that offers a speedy response, but it doesn't advocate rushing in regardless. An appropriate response requires reflection and ethical framing, and this is what can enable therapy and social change. But although speed is recommended, at the apex of a crisis, for example, it may be that what I have to offer, for example, could get in the way more than be helpful. And the reflective part of the social response cycle helps me to make an honest assessment of that which I may try to resist. Because in the waiting, in the not doing something, I have to deal with my sense of guilt and the pain of inaction. But in the waiting, what I try to do is to conserve and build up my energy and capacity so that I can take action when the time is right. So I'm talking about myself just to give an example of how the social response cycle is used. It's not that this is necessarily the way other people would use it, but that's how I try to work with it. And the reason why I am keen to include waiting when there is crisis is because that when the news outlets and the drama has gone, the misery remains. And that's when it might be the time to remember. And then is the time for someone like me to act, or you, or both of us together. So in this model, there's thinking, but as I said, we try to move quite quickly into doing when appropriate. And the doing is almost always a trial or a pilot project, which we can evaluate, observe, and respond to again in the light of the evaluation. So let me stay with the doing for a moment. As therapists, which many of us here are, not all of us, many of us, I think, on this call are, we're used to staying with discomfort. We're used to reflecting. But sometimes, in the face of a lack of formal evidence or frustration that our offering may not be enough, we can get stuck. So the social response cycle has given me the confidence to unmesh myself from that stuckness. And that's why I'm offering it as a model in case it can help to unglue you too. So the social response cycle and how to apply it has now been developed into a course which the BACP commissioned and which is freely accessible here. You just click on it and it's free whether you're a member or not. So some examples of how I've tried to apply the social response cycle are on the next slide. But I'm just mentioning them. There's no detail there, but you can find out more information if you're interested on the Passelo project website. So what kind of things have I used the social response cycle for? So I've used them in setting up interpreter reflective practice groups and then for going on to develop interpreter facilitated training. I've also applied it to thinking about how we were going to produce and fund an anthology of multilingual experiences in therapy called Tuning In, and that was published this year with the help of the National Lottery. I also used it in order to gain funding and to develop a project of an online course, and then to get some extra funding to adapt it for the Welsh language context. And then finally, as I mentioned, the principal project I was going to talk about, Colleagues Across Borders, is a project which has been going for 10 years. It matches people like psychotherapists, psychologists, counsellors, teachers, interpreters, and others with refugees in the Middle East, Southwest Asia. And these are people from a refugee background themselves who've trained as psychosocial workers fairly recently. And the offering that we are giving in Colleagues Across Borders is a sort of buddying collegiate relationship. And the entire project is done with zero funding. So the model of that project is that it is not in any way financially dependent. Any money that would be donated could be used for something practical that people need. So it's done for with no money at all. And I'll say a bit more about that model in a moment. So let's look at Colleagues Across Borders in a bit more depth. So what's the background and the rationale for it? So I want to kind of like talk you through this so that you can hear how I used the social response cycle and how I used my experience and my discomfort and what I actually did with that to create some action. So the background to the start of Colleagues Across Borders for me was watching the news in 2013 during the height of the Syrian war and witnessing the plight of the Syrian refugees. The horror of the situation wouldn't leave me, and I was plagued by guilt about my own inadequacy and about what I could do to help in any way. But I stopped myself from giving money immediately. I was desperate to make a donation, but I knew that if I did that, that would assuage my guilt enough and I would then move on. But I resisted because I wanted to stay with the discomfort, because in this particular case, I just felt sure that there was something that I and my practitioner colleagues could do, but I didn't yet know what. So the discomfort was huge. It just wouldn't leave me. And I sat with it and I did the thinking. So that's part one of my son's power formula. And I wanted to do something, but not something that would get in the way, that would take up resources. So travel or housing me or feeding me or protecting me, because all those resources, I believe, could be better used. So I asked myself the question, what can a therapist like me do with my sense of powerlessness and inadequacy when I read, watch, and listen to the news? And before I knew it, I was applying the social response cycle. So I'd observed the situation, I'd observed the response in myself, and I started to come up with a plan of action. I knew that the response would need to be something that could be done remotely, drawing on what our professional experience and practice could offer. Ethically, it didn't seem appropriate to offer remote support to people in direct need, but we could support those who supported others. And this next slide tries to give an example and to illustrate the taking, the observing, and thinking into doing an action. So, first of all, and even today, the response was teeny tiny. Bigger than just one person, though, so we could draw on the energy that comes from a collective. Also, a collective can offer checks and balances and accountability. But we started and we have stayed very small, and that's on purpose. As everybody knows bureaucratic structures are very hungry animals and they can eat everything that they come across. So we wanted to be small and nimble, resisting the lure of expansion if anybody offered us opportunities to expand. Not that anybody has, but they've had, we still would have resisted. So originally we were 5 or 6 practitioner colleagues, mainly based in the UK. And all of us were motivated by a sense of guilt and inadequacy. I said I would refer to guilt again, because it seems really important to me that those of us who want to offer our help in this way acknowledge what we are getting back ourselves. All of us, and all of us did, and all of us still do, who are involved with colleagues across borders, acknowledge that making some kind of offering from our set of capabilities was a way of dealing with our guilt and our inadequacy. And I think that not to acknowledge that can put you in a very virtuous position of feeling like you are an altruistic saint, which none of us are. Well, certainly none of us in Colleagues Across Borders. I won't want to speak for everybody here, but we're not. But we have got something to offer, and we get something back. Now that can seem very unfair, but in my opinion, it's a reality. We don't try to hide it. And as a guiding principle, I try to ask myself another question. I'm always asking myself questions. I try to ask myself another question in this type of situation. Is there any way that doing something that gives me relief might be of benefit for others too? So the relationships we have with our psychosocial colleagues are reciprocal and they are adult to adult. We've spent time thinking through a range of ethical issues for this project and drawing up a very, very simple set of procedures. Again, trying to avoid as much bureaucracy as possible, but still making sure that we are adhering to some procedures that guide us in our work. And then on October the 22nd, 2013, the first match was made between the practitioner colleague from here and psychosocial colleagues, in this particular case, in a camp on the borders between Libya and Egypt. And our psychosocial colleagues were working in an organization that I'd already done some work with and who were themselves refugees and who were offering psychosocial support in the refugee camp. So for anybody who still isn't clear about what is Colleagues Across Borders, I'm just going to put up some points. I won't go over the ones I've already mentioned, but I'll just put them up so that you can read them. So I've already mentioned, what do? We are supporting psychosocial workers who are themselves from refugee backgrounds. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned, which comes up in the next bullet point, is that I think I have mentioned it really because I talked about the finances, is that it's all pro bono. Okay, so it will only suit people who are in a position to be able to offer that. I recognize that. But for those people that it does suit, it works really well. As I said, it is pro bono, but we are getting something back. I've already mentioned that. And that. And just a little bit of information. What's the kind of support we offer? Well, this is just a tiny glimpse. So it might be information sharing about models of trauma and loss. Or we might be sharing glossaries of medical terms in different languages if we're supporting interpreters, for example. Overall, our support from here tends to be just listening to our colleagues' frustrations and sharing hopes for the future, for themselves and for their clients. So back to the social response cycle a bit, because this was the observing and then doing, and then we have the evaluation phase. So we try to keep thinking about how we're evaluating what we're doing. We meet regularly, those of us who are practitioner colleagues here, we have regular groups to reflect on the work together and think about it. But we also take feedback. So we have different structures. So an informal form of feedback is, for example, hearing back from managers of the places that we work about what they think about what's going on. Can they see any difference in their workers? And you can see here what one of the people said, the director who was the director of psychosocial services for a refugee support NGO in Middle East, Southwest Asia who was that director at the time. And this is what she said about the impact that it had. And I'll leave that for you just to read for yourselves. So as well as informal ways of taking feedback, we also wanted to do some formal ways of evaluating. And so we set up a small research pilot offering support to interpreters working in humanitarian crises. And then we evaluated it at the same time as a research action research pilot. And out of that came a paper called Self-Care as an Ethical Responsibility, a pilot study on support provision for interpreters in human crises. And what emerged from that little pilot was that the interpreters felt that the intervention, the collegiate matching and pairing and conversations had meant that they felt that they improved in terms of their confidence, their resilience, and their effectiveness. We also take feedback directly from the people who are our colleagues. And so here are some of the things that some of our colleagues have said. So some of them have felt that the contact with their practitioner colleagues, the conversations that they've had, have helped them to refresh and recharge themselves. And as a result of that, they've managed to avoid burnout and vicarious trauma. Some and all of them want this because they want to stay fit and well to support their fellow refugees as long and as well as possible. And many of the people that we work with, or who are our colleagues as psychosocial colleagues, are from a refugee background and are dealing with their own trauma experiences while also working with their clients and their clients' trauma experiences. And so it is a useful space for them to have to kind of process that with someone else who's not involved directly in their work. And also, some of our psychosocial colleagues may be extremely skillful and experienced. They may have been doctors and engineers or architects. They're now working as psychosocial workers, but some of our psychosocial colleagues are really very young. They never had any professional training before, and all of them are now working in a new profession in a new land. Now, that's just I've just briefly sort of touched on colleagues across borders, but we have another event coming up to celebrate the fact that, as I mentioned, we've been going for 10 years. So it's our 10, and oh no, before I get to that, I did a little bit of quantitative, trying to work out what we'd actually done in terms of quantity. Now, I managed to count up that since 2015, we've managed to make 98 meaningful matches between colleagues from here and our colleagues working in other contexts with refugees in the Middle East and Southwest Asia and so on. Now, that is a very modest number. And I'm putting it up there with great pride, even though it's modest and very humble, because it's 98 more meaningful matches than there would have been if we hadn't bothered to set up the project. And I think also what I want to say about those matches is that within each of those matches, I've only counted the matches where there have been really good relationships have been established. Many conversations have happened. I haven't counted up the individual conversations. And then as well as that, we have had at least 50 participants in training events, probably more. But I just want to at least give you them a bit of a sense of what we've also been doing. So back to the event, if you are interested in knowing some more about what we've been doing with colleagues across borders. Now, John and Online Events are very generously hosting our anniversary celebration, and it's free again. So they're donating their time and the platform to us so that we can put this on for free, which is fantastic. And in that presentation, you'll see in that event, you'll see some short presentations from colleagues from the UK and Egypt and elsewhere. And then there's more like it says there'll be a conversation about from us, but it will likely be a question and answer session, really. You're all really welcome. It's free, and you can find out more and register here. So the link's there, but as I said, you'll be able to see it in the recording, even if you can't get it from your screen right now. So one other thing I want to say about what other people might say about this. So some people may argue that attending to pressing needs, so basically attending to the symptoms without changing the underlying power structures, doesn't address the need for strategic change. Okay? And it's a really important point. I think, though, that change in power occurs in multiple and joint ways. It's not binary. So the sticking plaster and the policy papers and the campaigning marches are all needed together. So does teeny tiny and the power of teeny tiny work? Okay. It's interesting. There seems to be a small slide that's coming from someone else. I don't know how people do it. It's fascinating. But anyway, I think it's all right. Don't know where
I
that
think
came
sometimes
from.
if anybody cleans their screen on the
Oh,
touch screen, we might just get a little mark. So we're just trying to see how to
okay.
get rid of
Thanks.
that. But
Yes. Well, that's a general warning in life of just don't clean, really, isn't it?
I like that. I like it.
Okay. So back to the power of teeny tiny and does it work? So the kind of interventions we make with colleagues across borders, for example, don't address the underlying causes, but they create space and connections to think together and to try out new ways of responding to the symptoms. Colleagues supporting each other within a supporting circle of a project is a powerful way of creating solidarity, fueling and enacting change. The chain of relationships between us may help people to use their power individually and collectively. And that power can work silently to transform and to create hope and to create change. So how could this work for you? So it may be that a response to something that you notice as a gap in services or a therapeutically framed social justice need would not be appropriate in the form that colleagues across borders took. But I hope that this talk can act as encouragement to those who, like me, felt and feel inadequate in the face of great need, but who believe they have something valuable to offer from our professional practice and experience as counsellors, therapists, supervisors, and trainers. Even though I still feel, and interpreters, I'm so sorry, and others, even though I still feel inadequate in the face of the crises and disasters that surround us, and I know that a sticking plaster is no kind of solution, I also know that a sticking plaster can prevent infection and it can prevent things from getting worse. It's not enough. It's inadequate, but multiple inadequates can make a difference. And as Margaret Mead said, Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. What we do at Colleagues Across Borders is teeny. It's teeny tiny, but the effect is powerful. So I hope that I have been able to convey something of the power of teeny tiny, how getting over our sense of inadequacy and doing something can power change. It's just thinking and doing. Inadequacy is more than nothing. Teeny tiny is not something that has no value or importance. That's why I'm here now. If after this talk you all go out and together with a few other people, a group of thoughtful, committed citizens, and you do something teeny tiny, collectively, we may have done something massive. We may change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverley. Oh, there's just so much there. Yes. Thank you. Well, that gives us about 15 minutes, I guess, for some questions, maybe some comments. And Beverley, I guess you're moving your focus over to the chat as I am as well, so we can kind
Yeah.
of see what's there. Oh, a lovely piece of feedback straight back in there. You certainly conveyed it well, Beverley. You literally gave me not only inspiration, but hope in capital letters. So that's great. Yeah. Wow. 7 billion people doing teeny tiny things would have a massive impact, wouldn't it? Really would. Yeah. So we're kind of hoping to use the chat really. If you have some reflections, if you have maybe you have a question for Beverley, yeah, we'd love to kind of hear from you and try and respond on the to you. I mean, I really appreciated how you like that word inadequacy can kind of hit us really hard and deep, and that real encouragement to embrace that and not to somehow be moved by that into doing something maybe even unhelpful where we might be using up resources that are needed elsewhere. That felt very important, Beverley. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great summary. Thank you, John. Yeah. Yeah. John, it may be that people don't really have questions, or it may be that we just leave a moment so that if people feel they want to, they've got time to put something in the chat.
Mm.
But I don't want to, if we leave a moment and there isn't anything, then that's fine. We don't need to spend more time on it.
Yeah, well, let's take a bit of time. And there's a question there about, so where do you find new contributors from the ongoing cohort of refugees in the UK?
Yeah, I'm not really sure that we do that so much. We do occasionally have people who are refugees, but we are, for the colleagues across borders, certainly, um, because it's such a light touch management and supervision, we really need to work with people who are very experienced as psychological therapeutic practitioners, as supervisors, and so on. And so it may be that we are really lucky and we find somebody who's from a refugee background themselves. And in fact, we have in the past, but it's unusual. So we're not really expecting to recruit from that cohort. The refugees are the people who are doing the work, not in the UK, but in other settings. Yeah.
Seen a comment there about that guilt can fuel right action if we can sit with the discomfort. Yeah. I wondered if you had some thoughts about how you managed to do that, Beverly, or how kind of with colleagues you can support each other, how we can find the capacity to sit in those places. Like somehow we might not easy, but somehow we can find a way to do it in the therapy room that maybe we don't manage to do
Yeah.
outside of that room, and wondered if yeah.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to speak for myself, John.
Mm.
Okay. And if people find that helpful, that's great. But I can't speak for other people. So I've over the years, I've had to do an awful lot of work on my ego and my relationship with my ego. And one of the things that I think can push me to do more and want to do more is it is an ego need, it feels. And it feels that if I just want to get that satisfied, and then I can have a bit of relief from it. So it is about being able to have an internal conversation with myself about the fact that it might be satisfying me to do something, but actually it's not the right use of my energy. And that my energy needs to be either doing something else, or I need to be putting the concerns that I have into another space to be thinking about it, and waiting until the news outlets and the drama has gone, and it's just the dull, mundane tedium, everyday misery. And that's how to feed my ego in the same way. And so it's those kind of dialogues that I've tried to develop with myself. And goodness only knows they are very difficult, John. I'm not saying for a moment I've cracked it, but it's a commitment to have those kind of conversations. I don't know if that helps at all.
I think it does. I think like we as humans, the adrenaline that comes from those, like as things really start to emerge, can have such a big impact on us. And
Yeah,
yeah, and then, but I guess when that has passed, as it always does, I guess, and then also noticing what we're not drawn to might be the place where we might be most
yeah.
helpful as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's often I'm the wrong person, you see. I'm just not the right, but I want to be the right person. So if you come to the talk on Colleagues Across Borders, you'll see I share a video about Dr. Knott, who is a surgeon who was working in Syria. And I spent a lot of time berating myself that I am not a surgeon, because that is I could do something. I could do something really, really useful in a crisis, but I'm not that. I'm the wrong person for that situation. And rushing around, using up my energy, berating myself over that has not been a good use of my energy. It's kind of like I need to wait until what I've got to offer is the right offering.
And I guess you're thinking about sustainability too. Like, here's a project, it's 10 years old, that's a decade of, like, this is work that's not fueled by adrenaline. It's not glitzy or anything like that. It's just doing, keeping on every day, or, yeah.
Absolutely. It's not just the power of teeny tiny, it's the power of plinkety plonkety. Just plinkety plonketing on with it and keeping on going, you know.
Mm.
So there have been recent crises where people have responded very, very, very fast, but actually we've been plinkety plonketing on in the background. Nobody even knows what we're doing. And yet this is just this silent stuff in the background that's going on. And I'm not looking for publicity from this talk. I'm looking much more to share the joy that has come from being able to do this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, like, this is not a recruitment drive, Beverly. I could hear you saying, like, the organization is the size it needs to be. It's, yeah, it's a way of saying, well, you and the colleagues have managed to sustain this, and I
Yeah,
think it's really interesting what you're saying about how we then respond to our own ego, how you've worked with your ego, and that is a direct correlation between the psychological process, how we might attend to that, and the political impact that we can have in the world. Yeah, yeah.
brilliantly summed up, John.
Mm,
Thank you very much. I'll be
thank
coming back to you for some quotes.
you. Okay, okay. Yes, yeah. Well, and I think that's part of what we're looking for in this network. Like, what is that? This is working with the ego is something. I mean, we've different modalities have got different ways of kind of thinking about that stuff, of
Sure.
course, but that how we take care of our inner emotional, psychological world is something we think a lot of.
Yeah.
That's something we could really be helpful in the world with, is in the teams that
Very,
we're. Yeah. Mm,
very. That's what we can do. We're not surgeons, but we've got this offering that could be fantastic.
mm, yes.
Actually,
Yeah.
somebody here is a surgeon, by the way. I do recognize his name.
Okay. Okay.
Most of us aren't surgeons.
Yes. Well, I'm seeing a question in the chat about resting and restoring. Like, uh, like how do you have any tips on tips? Maybe maybe is not the right word, but continuing to nourish yourself. Have you seen anything that of that in the colleagues that you're working with? Like how, in order to keep going over these long periods of time, Beverly?
We have these regular meetings amongst ourselves where we think together and we reflect together and we are kind and have fun together a bit as well. It's only online, um, but we do it. And I don't know, those people who attend them might think different. I hope they don't, but I think it's very sustaining. It's very sustaining. And the fact, you see, because it's reciprocal, you don't, it isn't draining. It's not kind of like you don't end up thinking, oh God, I'm exploited, or it's not. It is absolutely nourishing of itself. And of course, we all get tired. When I've got too much on, I get tired, but it's only the volume of stuff. It's not the actual content that is tiring.
Mm, yeah, and then the choosing of the size, the choosing of how much to do. I guess everybody in that collective is thinking about what energy do I actually have to spend
Yeah,
here.
that's
That
right.
it's hard to measure when we're really filled with adrenaline.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so really to reflect accurately, what do I have that I can offer on a regular basis over a long period of
Yes.
time? Yeah,
Yes, yes, yes. If anybody who's adrenaline fueled, just it doesn't work for them. They're not right for us. It just they won't like it because we are much more thinking about what can we do that's sustainable. Let's keep it going.
yeah. I can see those. I got a message that's come to me private, but it's not. It's just the night. So let me read that out. Speaking as one of your colleagues, Beverly, the meeting are very stimulating and sustaining, and I learned so much through the conversations with colleagues with whom I am matched. Yeah, lovely, really
Thank
lovely.
you, whoever that was.
Yes, yeah, great. Well, we're just in the last few minutes. I'm just checking my notes as well. I, I, I'm thinking about the resources. We've got the link to the BACP page, so it's great to have a training in this too, that everybody can go through over to the BACP. As you said, it's not locked in any way, it's completely open for anyone who's here or anybody we might want to pass that resource on to. We've got the link for the event if people want to know more about or be in the celebration with us also, Beverly, of those 10 years. So be very welcome to come along. Yeah. So we'll share those we'll share those in the chat as we come to an end, and we'll send them via email also.
Yeah. Quick, there's a question. Can I just answer one question? I mean, there are lots that I would like to answer, but somebody's asked, how would you make contact with the NGOs that you thought you might work with? I mean, it's a really important question. And for this work, it always, for me, it has to start with personal contact. You know, if you haven't got some relationship or something going on already. So we started because I'd already done a piece of work for an organization. And then we did some work with them from Colleagues Across Borders, and then they put me in touch with someone else because they recommended on the, you know, they said, we know them, they're good, you can work with them. So that's how we've always done it. And it's about nurturing those relationships and really, really, you know, making them work. It's very personal. Everything about Colleagues Across Borders is very personal. It's one to one. Sometimes we run small groups as well, but it's about the personal contact and the relationship.
Yeah. And is there anything else in the chat you might think about? I mean, there, as you say, there's lots there, isn't there? But
Yeah. So a question about how can you tell us can you tell us a practical example of how we apply thinking and doing in our daily life? Probably not. No, because much more about you know, projects and things like that. But if you want some more examples of those, go and have a look on that BACP link, because we've developed some little cartoon videos of things that people, you know, of examples of the kind of project that can come about using the social response cycle.
right, and so here's the link to the BACP resource that I guess you've created. So that's just gone in the chat. If anybody
Fabulous.
struggles to get it from the chat, we'll also share that via email as well. And Maurice, maybe you can pop in the link to the event in December as well. Lovely. That's great. I think I we'd got the wrong ticket on that, so we just made that update. Thanks to our team for doing that. That was great, and that is ready to go. And colleagues,
Brilliant.
anybody who wants to come back and join us.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we probably are about ready, aren't we, John, to finish?
I think that's about time to kind of draw to an end. Yeah, there's lots of lovely feedback in the chat as well. So thank you to the colleagues who've been sharing feedback too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. This is what makes it, this is the reciprocity. You know, it's so lovely to get something back when we've done something. So I'm really, really grateful for that.
Well, and just I want to voice our appreciation to you, Beverley, for making some time in all the things that you do. You get a lot done in a week. So thank you also for making space to come and share like how you've been able to, with colleagues, sustain something over 10 years, incredible, and make a difference. It's a great model for us to reflect on and then do something with. So yeah, lovely. Thank you
Fabulous.
so
Thank
much,
you.
Beverley.
Thank you so much for the invitation.